So welcome everyone to another session in our lecture series titled Shifting Paradigms, Epistemic Resistance. My name is Jorge Vega and I have the honor of serving as your moderator today. We are privileged to host a highly relevant and timely conversation with the distinguished Nelson Maldonado-Torres under the title Beyond Decoloniality Light, Palestine, the War Against Decolonization and Combative Decoloniality. This event is organized by the Decolonial Research Group and the Student Coalition Berlin, which are groups of students concerned about the ongoing genocidal violence against the Palestinian people. The session will begin with a brief presentation, followed by a Q&A round open to the public. We invite all participants to actively engage in this conversation and to reflect on how we can contribute to a more just and equitable world from our own places of enunciation and action. Please be reminded that this session will be recorded for educational purposes and later dissemination. We are extremely pleased to have Dr. Nelson Maldonado-Torres with us. He is a leading voice in decolonial studies, African, Caribbean, Latin American philosophies, among other fields. He is professor of philosophy at the University of Connecticut, co-chair of the Frantz Fanon Foundation, and president emeritus of the Caribbean Philosophical Association. His work sheds light on paths towards combative forms of decoloniality, challenging dominant narratives, and advocating for an ethic of liberation. We are extremely thankful to him for accepting this invitation. So, without further ado, we welcome very much Nelson Maldonado-Torres.
Thank you very much, Jorge, and thanks for all the organizers of this event and everyone who is here today. To listen to some ideas that I originally thematized around the title Beyond Decoloniality Light, Palestine, the War Against Decolonization and Combative Decoloniality. And this is part of an ongoing reflection about the situation the tragic situation that we are witnessing these days, but actually beginning much earlier than that. On October 13 of 2023, less than a week after the intensification of the Israeli collective punishment on the Palestinian population of Gaza after Hamas attacks of October the 7th, Christopher Rufo, the right-wing activist who is attributed with inventing the conflict over critical race theory in the United States, declared on X, formerly Twitter, and I quote, "Conservatives need to create a strong association between Hamas, BLM, Black Lives Matter, DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, and academic decolonization in the public mind. Connect the dots, then attack, delegitimize, and discredit. Make the center left disavow them. Make them political untouchables." Close quote. Having previously directed conservative forces against critical race theory and even against liberal and neoliberal diversity and inclusion education, Rufo now turned his focus more specifically on what he refers to as academic decolonization. Rufo is not the only one making decolonization a direct target in the new context. Barely 2 weeks after Rufo's call, the English history and fiction writer Simon Montefiore published a long essay for The Atlantic entitled "The Decolonization Narrative is Dangerous and False." In the essay, Montefiore points to statements about Hamas's attacks on October 7th by students in various universities in the United States and to, quote, "the Weasley equivocations by some of America's most famous research institutions," close quote, alongside an open letter by thousands of artists calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. In these statements and expressions, Montefiore finds a, quote, shocking lack of morality, humanity, and basic decency, close quote. A notable point about the concrete examples to which Montefiore alludes to is that the author prefaces them with the following sentence. Even when the word decolonization does not appear, this ideology is embedded in partisan media coverage of the conflict and suffuses recent condemnations of Israel, close quote. In fact, neither the joint statement from the Harvard Palestine solidarity groups on the situation in Palestine, nor the statement from artists calling for a ceasefire mention the word decolonization, or even the word colonial or colonialism. Decolonization, however, is not only guilty by association, but is also presented as the driving force behind the spread of criticisms of Israeli violence at this juncture, which Montefiore can only see as support for Hamas and to quote, the justification for killing civilians. A few weeks after Montefiore's column, Elon Musk echoed a similar sentiment on X, formerly Twitter, when he wrote, quote, yes, decolonization, between quotes, necessarily implies a Jewish genocide. Thus, it is unacceptable to any reasonable person, which he followed with another message on X, indicating that, quote, as I said earlier this week, decolonization from the river to the sea and similar euphemisms imply genocide. Clear calls for extreme violence are against our terms of service and will result in suspension. These messages quickly had millions of views. More recently, in Germany, Felix Klein, the so-called German anti-Semitism czar, and I am quoting the Israeli newspaper Haaretz in this characterization, appointed as the first commissioner for Jewish life and the fight against anti-Semitism in Germany in 2018, publicly condemned what he referred to as post-colonial anti-Semitism, by which he meant a conglomerate of academic and intellectual positions, such as, to cite him, post-colonial theory, critical whiteness studies, and other social theories, for demonizing Israel and promoting hostility toward Jews. For him, the main problem that we should address today is not the genocide in Gaza, but rather, quote, claims at universities that Israel is a settled colonialist, imperialist project, an apartheid state, an implanted ethno-nationalist state that annihilates Palestinians with genocidal intent. It is notable that Klein avoids mentioning that some of these ideas are present in the South African case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, and that South Africa did not need post-colonial theory or critical whiteness studies to identify the existence of apartheid or genocide in what is currently going on. The South African long history of colonialism and apartheid is more than enough to teach them these lessons. Likewise, there is no mention that the government of the former German colony of Namibia, the site of the first genocide of the 20th century perpetrated by German colonizers against the Herero and Nama people between 1904 and 1908, has condemned Germany's opposition to the South African case at the International Court of Justice. Namibia did not need to learn about genocide from post-colonial theory either. It is to be noted that Klein did not need to receive instructions from anyone to engage, like Musk, Montefiore, Rufo, to engage in his attack on what he refers to as post-colonialism. Since he assumed his position in 2018, he has apparently become a state-sponsored designated voice, not just to address anti-Semitism, but also to merge the justifiable need to counter anti-Semitism with shutting down the critique of Zionism, and, even prior to October the 7th, to oppose the identification of apartheid in Israel. It was therefore to be expected that post-colonialism writ large would also be targeted as a dangerous discourse. We saw a similar phenomenon emerging after 9/11 in the United States, where programs in Middle Eastern studies and other area studies became targets of criticism, even as the entire edifice of area studies had initially been created to support the military and financial strategic interests of the United States. More recently, also in the US, largely as a response against Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement, we also saw something similar in the attack on critical race theory, which has led to changes in education in Florida, including the elimination of at least one sociology department. When today more and more people say explicitly or implicitly in face of what South Africa has formally described as genocide, and even the US president considers as indiscriminate attacks, to cite him, on Palestinians, that Palestinian lives matter, it is not surprising that a similar rhetorical state and right-wing machine will mobilize against any intellectual framework that makes sense of this statement. Klein's critique of postcolonial studies writ large reproduces the simplistic accounts of decolonization that one finds in Montefiore, and the same impulse with connecting decolonization with reverse racism and worse that one finds in Montefiore and Musk. But there is something particularly ironic about Klein's statement. It is the idea that the central problem with the postcolonial approach is that it reinforces what he refers to as a rigid perpetrator-victim schema, whereby the North is oppressor and the South is victim. The reason why I find this ironic is that one of the main narratives of the Netanyahu government to defend its genocides of Palestinian people is to render its heavily disproportionate response to the October 7th attacks as a, quote, battle of civilization against barbarism. Consider that when Netanyahu used this terminology, he was not speaking to other right-wing politicians, ideologues, or the right-wing public in Israel. No, the right-wing sector in Israel does not have to think about civilization against barbarism to justify the genocide against Palestinians. Many of them just think that the entire land of Israel, including Gaza and the West Bank, the entire Palestine, was divinely ordained to be an integral and permanent territory for Jews. This ideology is often found in the illegal settlements of Israelis in the West Bank. There, one finds the attitude that wherever the sheep owned by Israelis go, that is by definition Israeli land, irrespective of any agreed upon borders or international agreements. To be sure, this logic would likely be understood and supported by large sectors of evangelical Christians in the US, who have learned to combine their own anti-Semitism with their utmost support for the state of Israel on the basis of the role they see for Israel in the times near the apocalypse. This is, by the way, something else that Klein doesn't mention. He acknowledges Christian anti-Semitism, but says that, to quote, the Catholic and Protestant churches in Germany have confronted the ideological roots of Christian anti-Semitism. Contrary to this, the real problem for him is that anti-Semitism goes rampant among Muslims, as if Muslims and Jews have not coexisted in better terms than Christians and Jews in many settings. And particularly, he targets what he calls the Turkish religious authority. There is no mention of Christian Islamophobia or of the Christian apocalyptic philo-Semitism that one finds in the US, which is the strongest supporter of Israel, and that helps to drive the US war machine in cooperation with Israeli military goals. In short, Klein's is as partial and limited analysis as it is also irresponsible and Islamophobic. But let me go back to the main point, which is that when utilizing the main idea that in the genocide in Gaza, Israel is engaging in the battle of civilization against barbarism, Netanyahu is not speaking only to the right wing in the West or to the evangelical Christians in the US, but to the mainstream liberal public. This public is very familiar with the civilization against barbarism grammar, and Netanyahu knows that appealing to it will convey the idea and feeling that Israel's fight is justified and that it is part of an epic struggle that is also our fight of liberal-minded people in the West. That's the logic. As a result, the desired effect is to generate support for the war and the greatest degree of flexibility with the brutality of its methods and the level of carnage inflicted on Palestinian people. After all, as Israeli politicians often asserted after the October 7th attacks, they were dealing with, quote, human animals. And, as the president of Israel and others claim, there were no innocent victims in Gaza. In short, and no notion of innocent civilians either. In short, Israeli politicians were drawing on the long-known and effective schema of civilization against barbarism to justify not only disproportionate acts of violence, but also genocide. While Klein simplifies post-colonial studies writ large in terms of a perpetrator-victim schema, he does not pay attention to, first, the very clear and transparent way in which the Netanyahu government mobilized a civilization barbarism schema to justify genocide. And second, that this schema is understood and sustained by large amount of liberal, conservative, and even arguably the traditional Eurocentric left across Europe and the United States. I submit that one of the main reasons why post-colonial studies writ large and decolonization are so threatening to right-wing, center-right, and liberal governments across Europe and the United States is that they challenge this civilization barbarism schema. The civilization barbarism schema has functioned as a basis of Western empires since the long 16th century, since at least the long 16th century, and it is constitutive of the very idea of Western modernity, that Western thought and institutions are best prepared to advance civilization in comparison to any other human culture group or systems of conviviality in the world, in the globe. The civilization barbarism idea took explicitly racist dimensions in the context of the spread of 18th century taxonomies, leading to eugenics, while finding expressions in nation-building projects, perhaps best represented by the idea of manifest destiny in the making of the United States. What Europe gave the United States, the compass for a nation-building project premised on the civilization barbarism divide, the US gave back to Europe in what James Whitman has characterized as Hitler's American model, which is the title of the book, where he documents the way in which Hitler and German fascists were drawing from forms of racist organization, genocide, and ethnic cleansing in the US. Klein complains that postcolonial studies participates in Holocaust denialism, which is far from true, without addressing the much larger denialism in which he engages. The denialism of the foundational role of the civilization barbarism schema in the making of the modern West, including the US, Germany, and, alluded by Netanyahu himself, Israel, as well as in the logic of extermination that was horribly displayed in the Holocaust, connected to this denialism. Denialism of the terrifying role of the civilization barbarism schema is, of course, not new or recent. It is rather constitutive of the empire and national myths of the globalized modern West. By the globalized modern West, I do not mean only Europe, the US, or Israel, but also every other nation-building project that has reproduced the Western apparatus of the state, or that reproduces the civilization barbarism logic in their own political forms of authority and social organization. That is, the West is not only a place, but a project and a system of differentiated places which could be conceived as a global context of structural heterogeneity, to cite Aníbal Quijano. When I say that denialism of the civilization barbarism schema is not new, I immediately think of MSSR's classic text, Discourse on Colonialism, which he wrote shortly after the end of the Second World War. In this book, Césaire argues that Europe seems determined, after the war, to reproduce the state of decadence that led it to the Second World War and the Holocaust in the first place. He said this because, in face of the devastating destruction of the war and the Holocaust, he found many Europeans addressing the calls for decolonization in various parts of the world with the idea that colonization was different from what happened in the Second World War because it was a form of civilization, of taking civilization to decolonized. As a result, while Europe saw itself justified in rising against Germany, peoples in the colonized territories were not justified to rise against the Europeans. If anything, they owe gratitude because they brought civilization. This distinction is maintained until today, which is why Klein finds a problem in that Frantz Fanon consider, and he cites Fanon in the column. He mentions Fanon. He finds the problems in that Fanon considered violent resistance against colonialism legitimate. But Klein does not find a problem or even mention that Fanon fled from his native island of Martinique when he was 18 years old to join the Free French forces in the war against the Nazis. Not only that, but Fanon writes in Black Skin, White Masks that he joined the war to respond to the plight of what he calls his brother the Jew, and that he had been taught that an anti-Semite is always anti-Black. Fanon's participation in war is not problematic when it is for the Fanon's participation in war is not problematic when he is at war with joining with the French forces, but his observations on violent responses to oppression are to be condemned when he fights with Algeria or with Algerians. Here is the civilization barbarism schema at work again. For Césaire and many other colonial subjects across the globe, the lesson to be taken from the Second World War and the Holocaust should have been different from what they overwhelmingly found in Europe. That the end of the war was an opportunity for Europe to take a role in the elimination of all forms of global, structural, and systemic violence, starting with Europe's role in the presumed discovery, conquest, and colonization of a large part of the planet. The end of the Second World War was an opportunity to engage in reparations and into what Césaire referred to as a politics of nationalities, which would counter anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, anti-indigeneity, and Islamophobia in global affairs, among other forms of dehumanization at the same time. At the end of the Second World War, however, Western Europe seemed more concerned with obtaining support from the United States and building an alliance against the Soviet Union than anything else. In this context of the Cold War and the emergence of a so-called Third World, the civilization barbarism found new forms of expression. If we consider that today, again, the Israeli government is mobilizing the civilization barbarism schema to justify its genocide, it should not be surprising that many are seeing the links between the Israeli state and other states like the US, which are settled colonial states, and with the legacy of Western imperial powers. Predictably, denialism, hypocrisy, and decadence prevail in state responses that owe their sense of legitimacy to the civilization barbarism schema, which is what must be protected by all means. Given this context, it is thus not surprising either that decolonization and post-colonial studies writ large, which expose and critique the foundational role of the civilization barbarism schema, represent such a threat to the established order and the national myths of origin in the West, particularly the US, European countries, and Israel, but not only. What we should be doing instead is thinking about how to overcome the whole of the civilization barbarism schema and to allow ourselves to see the world in a new light. A light we're saying that Palestine should be free from the river to the sea is not automatically translated in the dominant terms of the racial state, as if one were calling for the eradication of any given population group, but as an invitation to coexistence in terms that go beyond the civilization barbarism dynamic and the promises of racist liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes in the entire region. Now, I want to focus in a kind of a second part of the presentation on this notion that appears in particularly Montefiore's attack on the discourse on decolonization, which is that decolonization, in a way, has taken over the academy, has colonized the academy. And I wanted to make some comments about that argument. And starting with that, it is false that decolonization has colonized the academy, as if it has taken over it. It is true that some fields and subfields in the humanities and human sciences have recently paid attention to the question of colonization and decolonization more than before now, because different discourses have joined postcolonial, what has been postcolonial studies with decolonial thought, also with different forms of anti-racist and anti-colonial intellectual formations come together and have created kind of impact in different areas. But by and large, the dominant areas in the liberal arts and sciences are fundamentally liberal in scope and firmly adhere to what Sylvia Wynter referred to as the liberal creed. Those of us taking decolonization seriously do it against all odds. The academy for us is not a safe place that offers support, but continues to be a battlefield. To be sure, the discourse of decolonization raises such anxieties that even a small portion of it is considered excessive. In that sense, the war against decolonization is not some new right-wing project, but rather a constitutive feature of the vision and mission of academic liberalism and the university qua white academic field. It is a war that has undermined and sidelined the questions and theories formulated by the indigenous, Black, and third world movements that challenge the myth of Western civilization as a form of salvation. The irony of the right-wing alarm about what they call academic decolonization is that from the perspective of anti-colonial and decolonial movements, academic decolonization by and large is a form of metaphorical decolonization, or what could be referred to as decoloniality light. That is, academic decolonization has implied a certain attempt to commodify the uncommodifiable by rendering decolonization into a metaphor, academic problem, a perspective, or a research topic. Decolonization has not colonized the academy. If anything, the academy has partially colonized the discourse on decolonization by turning it into a research theme, a bureaucratic process, the object of task forces or task teams, a call for window dressing, or an effort to find a new ground for the same old disciplines and sciences, rather than a struggle or a combat. As an academic exploration, decolonization becomes an area of specialization or a subfield to be supervised and managed by middle-class academics in institutions that promise class mobility to its main constituents, students. To be sure, for the fascist and proto-fascist right-wing and center-right liberalism, this is already more than what citizen subjects and the polity in general should tolerate. And it is now turning to connect decolonization with the celebration of murder and the dismemberment of babies, as in Montefiore's narrative. That is, they are portraying anyone who sympathizes with the discourse on decolonization as a human animal. The intended result is clear: an exhortation to rid universities of these human animals and for the suspected human animals to seek affirmation of their humanity through the rejection or severe commodification of decolonization discourse in the academy. What should we do in face of this state of affairs? The answer lies in what we should have been already doing all along: to anchor the decolonization discourse and project in movements and collectives that are combating colonization and coloniality, particularly those that do so outside of the confinement of the university or any such liberal institution. Also important is to connect or weave the colonial movements with each other and to engage in movement-generated thinking, creation, and action. Since the declared war on decolonization brings Israel-Palestine conflict to us who aim to pay serious attention to decolonization, we can take the current time as an opportunity to seriously reflect on the relevance of decolonization to understand the conflict and the relevance of the conflict to better understand colonization and decolonization. So I want to say a few words about how the struggle for decolonization has been connected for a long time with the Palestinian struggle, meaning it's not something new or purely academic. We did not have to wait for the right-wing war on decolonization to be compelled to consider the connection between decolonization and the Palestinian struggle. While it is not true that decolonization has colonized the academy, Palestinian movements and intellectuals have long considered Israel as a settler colonial power. Also important are the historical ties between Native American movements and the Palestinian struggle, as well as those between the Black and the Palestinian liberation projects. Consider the connections between these movements in the aftermath of the June 1967 war, when Israel took over the West Bank and Gaza. As Sam Clark, a historian of Black internationalism, puts it, quote, "The conflict captured Black activists' attention at a time when the Vietnam War was already prompting them to condemn what they saw as US imperialism abroad. Many in the Black freedom movement saw Israel's conquest of Palestinian lands like the US war in Vietnam as an imperial parallel to the racialized violence African Americans experience at home. The Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee published a primer on the Palestine problem, describing Zionism as an imperial project upheld by the white Western colonial governments of the United States and Europe." Close quote. Clark further adds that, and quote again, "The Black Panther Party, meanwhile, expressed its support for the Palestinian resistance that emerged in the war's aftermath, portraying al-Fatah and the Panthers as engaged in a joint struggle against racism, Zionism, and imperialism. For these groups, African Americans were an internally colonized people whose position in the United States was analogous to the status of third world peoples globally, Palestinians included." Interviewed for the Toronto Star, Professor Chadney Desai from the University of Toronto comments that not long after the June 1967 war, quote, "Palestinians and indigenous peoples in Canada came together when the Third World People's Coalition hosted a PLO delegation in Vancouver. The shared framework of colonialism and apartheid allowed Palestinians to make ties with indigenous struggles here, especially around land and reclamation issues." Desai said, "The first intifada against Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza was taking place in 1990 during the Oka crisis, a months-long Mohawk resistance against the government of Canada and Quebec. The Intifada became an inspiration for the indigenous warriors to say, how can we engage in militant resistance, but not in a way that our people are all thrown in prison? How do we shift our tactics?" Close quote. More recently, the connections between the Palestinian and the First Nation struggle were reaffirmed in the context of opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline process. As the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights has put it, quote, "Many Palestinians and First Nations are standing together against the common colonial agenda of their occupiers. When the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe water protectors rose in powerful resistance to the APL, to the Dakota pipeline, US police used tear gas, rubber bullets, pepper spray, sound grenades, and water cannons against the Standing Rock water protectors. These weapons are all too familiar to Palestinians protecting their lands, water, sovereignty, and burial grounds from Israeli colonization. Palestinians, the US, and the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions National Committee in Palestine issued powerful statements of solidarity with the Standing Rock resistance, and the Palestinian youth movement organized a cross-country solidarity caravan to Standing Rock, publishing an inspiring statement, close quote. Also recently, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza engaged in demonstrations of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. Shri Paradkar, a reporter in the Toronto Star, indicated 3 years ago that, quote, across Canada, thousands of people have rallied to support Palestinians as they were newly bombed by Israel. Both Black Lives Matter and Idle No More have released solidarity statements. Last year, while a mural of George Floyd appeared on an Israeli separation wall in the West Bank city of Bethlehem, the Palestinian flag was hoisted alongside the Mohawk and Hiawatha flags in Tyendinaga near Belleville, Ontario, at a February 2020 pipeline protest, close quote. Farah Kutaine, in a report for the New Arab, wrote in July last year that Native Americans would wear Palestinian keffiyeh while protesting the construction of Line 3 and the Dakota Pipeline, and the Palestinian Youth Movement delegations stood shoulder to shoulder with indigenous communities, protecting their land from further colonial and corporate plunder. And these kinds of associations and solidarities are, of course, are themselves kind of announcing what is a form of interaction and of living together post the civilization barbarism scheme. Right? So while you're opposing colonialism, at the same time, this is a very Fanonian theme, you are creating the basis for a different set of relationships. Black, Palestinian, Native American, and First Nations peoples have thus indicated important linkages and connections between the indigenous, the Black liberation, and the Palestinian struggles. They have taught us that the struggles are connected and that an attack on any one of them is an attack on all of them. Therefore, when we stand for any of them, we should also stand with all of them. This is the main insight captured by collectives such as the New York City-based Decolonized Displays, which simultaneously focuses on the indigenous land back movement, the Black liberation movement, and the Palestinian struggle. I see collectives like Decolonized Displays as the leading forces behind an effort to keep alive the flame of a combative decoloniality above and beyond the decoloniality light that we often find in academia. So I wanted to round this up by saying that it is often said that, like Klein also argues in his essay, that if one were committed to decolonization and anti-racism, one will be invested in the critiques of various forms of racism, and not only in Israeli forms of racism and Islamophobia. But if you look at the entire corpus of post-colonial criticism and decolonial thought writ large, you will find engagement with myriad forms of settler colonialism and racism. It's not difficult to find. Also, as the examples of cross-racial solidarity that I just cited demonstrate, critics of Israeli settler colonialism are often also critics of settler colonialism and or racism in many other places, and they also link and combine the struggles. What groups like Decolonized Displays add to this picture is that support to the Palestinian struggle against apartheid and for the search of decolonized forms of conviviality in the region should not be limited to demonstrations in support of an immediate ceasefire, as important as they are, or as demonstration for the Palestinian struggle in general, but that they should be part of an ongoing participation in anti-racist and anti-colonial movements wherever we find ourselves. I stop there. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this enlightening and thought-provoking presentation. It has surely set the stage for a deeper dive into these complexities and urgencies of decolonial thought and decolonial action. So now we are moving on to the Q&A session. We would like to start asking some of the questions we have prepared and then open the floor to our public. So I would start saying, as we mentioned, we are a group that is based in Germany, and Germany is no doubt a champion on decoloniality light. I mean, until recently, there was a sort of state version of decoloniality, especially among the state-funded social and cultural organizations that fell completely silent on Palestine post-October 7th. We still haven't heard a single word from them on this issue. And of course, not to mention the academics who commodified the concept for years. And now that it's risky, they just pretend it doesn't exist and fall to the purge of the decolonial position in universities and public spaces and so on, which is, of course, absolutely contrasting to the decolonization that is coming from the mobilized students. So our question will be, your idea of combative decoloniality helps to distinguish between those decolonial projects that do have emancipatory purposes from these others that, let's say, kind of bourgeois instrumental misappropriations of the decolonial term. But there is also this thing that you already mentioned, like an underlying aspect that also is kind of a critique to certain decolonial approach that, while not reactionary or not necessarily counter-revolutionary, overly focus on epistemological shifts rather than developing a proper organic thought linked to emancipatory and anti-colonial struggles. Could you please further develop on this?
Yes, thank you. I mean, first, I wish I knew more about the German context to see, to see about this or to evaluate or think about this state entity that you mentioned that kind of could be seen as a representative of the coloniality light. And I say that because, for example, in the US, it sort of never barely ever gets to even anything like that when it comes to institutional, right? Very rarely, because for most of the time here, projects collapse into the diversity, equity, and inclusion framework, which is even more disconnected from decolonization struggles than this decoloniality light, right? So that's kind of a liberal, an extension of the liberal tolerance spirit of tolerance towards different religions and so-called. You expand it to some extent and you can accommodate certain kind of issues. Of course, what happens is that there is a mistranslation of anti-racist claims and projects that are generated by social movements. And everything is boiled down into liberal terms, in terms that can be accommodated and dealt with by the state and by the neoliberal economy. And actually, sometimes neoliberal economic kind of dominated context, you find that questions of diversity and inclusion work very well because you just want to have a kind of a very diverse body of technicians, of engineers, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean that you are questioning capitalism or that you are challenging the structure and practices of domination that are reproduced in different institutions. So yes, that will be whether we can qualify that as decoloniality light or as something, an extension of liberalism. That I would like to know more to give a comment. But certainly, we find many of these notions of decoloniality light in the academy, and I mean by decoloniality light, I mean non-combative forms of decoloniality, and that sometimes can turn into anti-combative forms of decoloniality. And here I'm drawing from Frantz Fanon, who creates this distinction between combative writing and combative literature and combative actions, and then pre-combative modalities of engagement that many times end up in a place of, he writes, no exit, right? No escape. And sometimes can turn anti-combative, and sometimes can turn against the very movements that are generating, decolonial ideas on the ground. So in the academy, I think that that's a lot of what we're seeing. And so, but decoloniality light, breaking with decoloniality light cannot be done simply by, say, making a statement about Palestine, right? Like you can be, you may make a statement pro in favor of the Palestinian struggle, even a very brave and sophisticated statement, that doesn't mean, as I see it, that you are necessarily breaking with the model of decoloniality light. Because many times the statement form, right, as important as they are and can be, right, and we need more statements, but we need much more than that. And sometimes the statement in the world of decoloniality light, the statement is more or less the climax of that project, right, where you pronounce yourself in certain ways in public. But then your praxis and the different ways in which you engage in your intellectual work doesn't really change fundamentally. You're still thinking about decolonizing anthropology, about creating new methods in this area, about legitimizing yourself as an academic in one area or the other by introducing the thematic of decolonization. And it tends to collapse also in projects of diversifying the sources or diversifying the curricula. And the question that is typically not raised, and actually I would say that typically in the context of decoloniality light, the question that becomes central in that sphere is the question, how do I apply decolonial theory to something, right? To your object of investigation. So many times scholars are, subjects in the search for the lost research objects, right? And they need to look in search for the lost theory and the lost research object. And so the question, how to apply this theory into that? The question of application. How do we apply this into academia? How do we apply this into decolonizing the curriculum? Right? All kind of technical questions like that. But I think that the more crucial question is not about application, it's about grounding. How do we make sure that this decolonial thinking is grounded in decolonial movements and that we're thinking with collectives that are doing this work? These collectives, when they do their work, they tend to engage in theory making, artistic production, and various other forms of activities. Meaning that, yes, there is a problem if you conceive decoloniality as an exploration of different epistemologies or as a critical as epistemological critique or the critique of disciplines. There is definitely a problem and a limit with that. But the same problem would exist if you say you reject, let's say, that kind of focus on epistemology and you focus on the analysis of institutions, right? And you think that by focusing on the economy, on how institutions work, that somehow you have escaped, right, that decoloniality light because you're no longer doing epistemology. No, that can be another modality of engaging in decoloniality light, only oriented to different forms of analysis. So when I'm thinking about breaking for decoloniality lights, requires more a kind of a resignation with the system of recognition and the system and the way that excellence is conceived in the academy. And it's a practice where your interlocutors are already way more than simply your peers in the academy, right? That your interlocutors are rather co-combatants and you're a co-combatant with them. And when you have combative decoloniality, it's not a question about you producing any particular other intellectual, right, critique of epistemology or critique of an institution. It's rather you participating with others. And for these forms of critique and the generation of new ideas, when they start to get generated kind of collectively, and where you could be the author of some of them, but then other people are this thinking is generated and done in collaboration. And that across the walls that separate the academy from the outside and so on with other institutions. So I think that's more that, so it's certainly not in the institutions of the state, they tend to be liberal. And then these radical pockets in academia where you adopt decolonization, which is very threatening to the status quo as it is. Even decoloniality light is overwhelmingly threatening because it risks, it calls attention and puts into evidence the problems with the civilization barbarism schema, right? So it makes contributions, but it's a risky endeavor because at any given moment, it is not grounded enough, and at any given moment, it can turn anti-combative and anti-decolonial.
Thank you very much. In this line, following this discussion, I was wondering, remembering of people like Ochi Curiel and others, that are like very clear that in a way decolonizing university means making it disappear. If the colonial position ends up in an abolished position, abolished in the university, does it make any sense to keep working on them, to keep trying to break them down, to make the cracks, as Catherine Walsh says sometimes?
Yes, I think that these positions are all kind of connected and compatible with each other. For example, you while the institution is there, you identify those cracks, seek to expand them, seek to make them grow, right? You contribute to them, but you are working in the crack not to close the gap, not to close the crack, right? Not to pour cement over the crack, but rather to crack it more. And this collective cracking can lead to this abolition, to this end. I think that this is one of the forms of differentiating this decoloniality light from the combative decoloniality. One, it's not the only one, and this alone does not allow us to make the distinction. But usually in decoloniality light, we find instrumentalization of the decolonial, where the decolonial becomes only the possibility of rebirth of what is already existing, right? So it leaves abolition out of the door. But if you think about decolonization through the lenses of for example, the history of the Haitian Revolution in Haiti, right? Anti-colonialism, decolonization, and abolition were part of the same project. And I think that what some of us try to capture with the idea of decoloniality is a name of referring to the linkage between these different imperatives that we still face today. And so in a recent writing, I think it would appear later this year, I kind of made the case for the abolition of the humanities. And the humanities understood as the vertebral column of the liberal arts and sciences, right? And so if that column is abolished, the whole system of organizing, the whole way of organizing knowledge is abolished. Now, abolishing the humanities doesn't mean that we abolish thinking or philosophy or what we know as literature. The humanities is rather that way of organizing these different human activities. So it's a way of free these human activities, right? Of free them from this kind of framework and umbrella, which is heavily anchored in Western liberalism, right? And it has become a refuge for liberal whiteness, even as many of us in the humanities have challenged the humanities and have extended them and have stretched them. And I think it's time to call and engage in the abolition of the humanities. So yes, when we engage in decolonization, we should not be thinking that whatever we're decolonizing will exist. We don't know. Decolonization is rather the opening up of a new set of possibilities and activities and the generation of something different, certainly from what is dominant. And we can be drawing from so many different kind of languages and practices. So it is irresponsible and limited to think that of decolonization as somehow the redemption of something that already exists, without the thinking that this can and maybe should be abolished. But these things cannot be determined simply, in some cases, they cannot be determined simply beforehand or simply by an individual, like, this intellectual that does it. It should be built on rather a record of different insurgencies, right? And that is what I think allows one to make these calls, whether you push in one direction or another. But certainly when we talked about the modern colonial world, what we are thinking is the emergence of a different set of relationships and institutions. That doesn't mean that we are not going to find things of value in some of the institutions and ways of thinking that exist now, particularly when some of those institutions and ways of thinking have stolen and taken from communities across the world resources and ideas. So we just need to relate them differently.
I would like to take this kind of revolutionary spirit that is entailed, as you described, with the colonial politics, but now trying to move back our gaze to Palestine. In some ways, the colonial and the genocidal violence we see today against the Palestinian people it's a reiteration that the colonial violence is not a relic. It in no ways belongs to the past, but it's alive and it's operating at this precise moment. And that is part of the dynamics of imperial and capitalist domination. Now, in this context, and following what you said, and following on the attempt of the bourgeois states to silence the combative decolonial discourse, could we think about the decolonial turn to be considered kind of the new enemy to be defeated by imperial capitalism? Or can the decolonial political position somehow coexist with liberal forms of capitalism, for example, where state sovereignties are respected, imagining an environment that is no longer hegemonic, but multipolar, for example?
Yes, well, I think that if you approach this question through, let's say, a liberal framework, I mean, you can understand why not only conservatism, but liberalism resists the kind of questions and issues that are put at the center on the table in decolonial thought and post-colonial studies writ large, right? So there have been a kind of not only an antipathy, but also like like in the gender of the Republic, used to say in France, a kind of immune defense system against any of these ideas that put at the center, right? Liberalism has its own immune system against these ideas that bring other issues, ideas that question the civilization barbarism dichotomy, right? So that has been there. Now is coming more to the fore for multiple reasons at this time. We do not know how long will this be, right? This new attack on decolonization as such. In the US, it has been so far mainly, as I said, has been attack on critical race theory, and attacked on other forms of studies. Now there was a recent call to also explicitly target decolonization. In France, there had been since several years ago an explicit attack on decolonization because the movement of the indigenous of the Republic, right, they were engaged, and other kind of allies were in the public sphere, bringing up these questions, right? And so they came out, these issues, decolonization appear as not simply as a secondary intellectual framework, but as a viable form of looking of analysis that had political repercussions. And so it was immediately targeted, and it was intended to be shut down. So there was several years ago a letter of about 80 intellectuals going publicly with a declaration against decolonization, that discourse about decolonization in France was about, nativism, reverse racism, what they call their communitarism, and so on. So France was actually at the forefront of some of this, explicitly around decolonization. Now we find it in Germany, we find it in the US. We don't know how long will this be, will this take place, we will know. My sense is that, again, for those of us who are doing this work, we should not be so much distracted by these attacks. We should be struggling to connect our efforts with those on the grounds that are doing even the more comprehensive decolonial work, right? If anything, this is a call for us to keep focus on that. Having said that, I think that it will be ideal to get more, let's say, consistent liberals that are more tolerant of diversity, right? And I'm using the liberal terminology for this, because I think even using the liberal terminology, you could make the point that under liberalism, there could be institutions that allow for the cultivation of multiple perspectives, including decolonization, right? So I think that liberalism, and that liberals should be actually one of the best ways in which liberals can counter explicit fascists and the right wing in their various countries, is to make sure that there is real intellectual and diversity and diversity of practice on their university campuses, schools, and so on, because they want to limit the voices of legitimate knowledge production in the university to the extent that they are allowing right-wing mentalities and fascisms to be nurtured right there. And they are making it more difficult for the next generations to obtain at least some conceptual tools to counter fascism. So I think liberalism is becoming complicit with fascism when it tries to clean the academic space and this public space from projects that centralize decolonization. Even from a liberal perspective, they should see decolonial perspectives as providing tools that help us to counter the fascism that we all agree that we don't want to see, right? The pro-genocide perspectives that we don't want to see. And so that's a challenge, I think, for the liberals. But, I think for people who work in liberal institutions, they could be making that point, creating spaces so that, to make it less difficult to create the cracks, right? To make it less difficult to create those cracks, to actually create spaces that can nurture to some extent different ways of thinking. And I think that can benefit the institution as a whole and the student body as a whole, new generations, benefiting even the liberal in the sense that you will have people more prepared to counter fascism and conservatism. And maybe then we will producing a society which will be liberal will be the more right-wing part, right? Instead of the opposite. But again, I think that the focus on those of us who are committed with decolonization should be rather in this relationship with movements on the ground.
Thanks. And speaking about right-wing, this is more like kind of pedagogical question, more thinking about Netanyahu and his accomplices. I mean, the current policies we see are probably the most revolting example of right-wing policy. But we are also in the face, as you mentioned, of the rapid rise of right-wing and far-right regimes all around the globe. So I was wondering, from someone who is not familiar with this terminology, what is the key contribution? What would you say is the key contribution of the decolonial turn among various other forms of anti-systemic struggles and resistance? It could be socialists or anarchists, or even those that are beyond this kind of Eurocentric realm, coming from indigenous resistance and so on. What would you think it would be like the key element that decolonial puts into the table as a part of the repertoire of these people who participate in those struggles?
Yeah. Well, I would say that maybe I'll mention two. One of them maybe covers decolonial thoughts, decoloniality, but also post-colonial studies writ large, right? Which is what I said before, is this identification of the schema civilization barbarism as foundational for Western civilization project, and even for the modern nation state as fundamental. Identifying it as fundamental and giving us tools to critically assess it, right? And then to allow us to think about how to overcome it, right? So I would say that that's key and maybe common to probably most of these forms of post-colonial and decolonial thinking. And that's, I think, a major contribution. And as I said, something that even the liberal world aims, is contesting, is rejecting in so many ways, right? And that's why, again, Netanyahu came to the West, came to the US, went to Europe immediately, in the couple of weeks after October the 7th, saying that our war is a war of civilization against barbarism, right? So I think he understood clearly what resonates in that culture. But I think what resonates in that culture is precisely this point that post-colonial studies and decolonial thought challenge, which is why then it becomes a target, right? But the second point that I think is particularly related with the project, the thinking around decolonial thought and the ideas around decolonial thinking, is that, the process that Western modernity not only produced colonialisms, but also it itself became a structure of coloniality. right? That coloniality is not something episodic, something that happened in a period, in a particular moment of the history of Western civilization. It is something foundational, something that continues to happen even after the end of formal relations of colonialism, even after the end of juridico-political colonialism, which means then that decolonization is a struggle that goes beyond particular historical moments of searching for independence. Decolonization could be reconceptualized as decoloniality, to refer to the different modalities of action, to undermine the coloniality of power, knowledge, and being, the colonial matrix of power, and to produce different sets of relationships and institutions and ideas and practices, right? So those will be two sets of ideas, one related to the whole field of post-colonial, decolonial studies, and so on, and the second particularly anchored in what is now known as decolonial thought.
Thank you. I will just bring a last question before opening the floor to our participants. This is just to something that came along from your last answer. This I would like to quote a question that you already listened in one of your conversations with Oyerwonki Oyewumi, who said that, okay, if we put so much attention, so much effort into decolonizing, aren't we not necessarily attempting to, but aren't we unconsciously putting again the colonizer in the center? Is everything we do colonization?
Yes, and my answer to her, I mean, first there is a sense in which we're both that question, and I think is connected with my concern with decoloniality light, right? That's something that happens, I think, with decoloniality light, that it keeps, you say that you're decolonizing something, but it keeps that something at the center anyway, right? And it keeps bringing back some of the same fundamentals. You want to decolonize anthropology, but you're presupposing that you're keeping anthropology. Or you're decolonizing sociology, but you're presupposing, and that is constraining and limiting the activities that you're engaged with, as makes you in a way as someone who is just trying to transform in a space internally to the liberal institution that created it, right? And your position as a scholar remains unquestioned, untouched. If anything, you reemerge now as the expert on how decolonizing this field. So I see those problems, but for me, that's a problem with decoloniality light. When you read about decolonization, like when you go to Fanon and you read about decolonization, I don't think that you're going to have this impression that you're Oyerwonki, right? Oyerwonki's impression is coming, I think, from the overwhelming presence of decoloniality light in universities. And this is the problem that we find. But when you look at decolonization of people that were in the ground, organizing, activating, actually, the first thing is that they were engaged with each other, not so much with the institution, right? When we are decolonizing the academy in some ways, we keep what we think that we can do in citing other scholars, right? Creating new journals, we maintain that. But in the actual struggle for decolonization, what you often find is people, decolonize this place, put it like people who were not meant to meet each other, encountering each other and beginning to create a new set of relationships and sharing all kinds of experiences and knowledges out of there. So it is first and foremost a kind of creative moment of infusion that is not limited by whatever institution you are, because you're coming together with people who are located also in different institutions. So it doesn't look like academic decoloniality. It doesn't look like decoloniality light, right? Only in that space, I think then you have that notion that you're going to keep repeating, because decolonization is still focusing on what you are targeting. Whereas in the combative decoloniality, the focus is in what you are creating and fostering with others collectively, right? And that's therefore the creative aspect of decoloniality. So my answer to her was therefore that I think that in combative decoloniality, also because in decoloniality light, let me add this, as I said before, the question of abolition, it seems to be since on the side, right? Since different, completely different from the question of decolonization. But if you think from combative decoloniality, and if you think from the legacy of these issues in the Caribbean, where decolonization and abolition of slavery were connected, then you're not prioritizing the master or the structure and so on, even as you may be engaging with some aspects of it. You are building something else for something else that you're bringing together. So I therefore think that the combative decoloniality is more creative, and that the problem that what she observes is definitely a problem, but I think that has been a failure of decoloniality light, and it points to the need of engaging more substantial forms of decolonization that take us away from the constant reinsertion of the master and the master narratives, right, and the institutions that make us into only scholars when we could be co-combatants with others in the struggles.
Thank you. Thank you very much again, Dr. Maldonado-Torres. And now we are opening the floor for our public to participate in Q&A. Please, you can submit your questions via the Q&A function, so we have the chance to read them out loud. We have some already here, so I will read the first one. It says, what can be expected from the decolonial perspective when many of its most internationally prominent representatives remain silent in the face of the Palestinian genocide and the political persecution of colleagues who actively denounce it and struggle for an active and material decolonization of the academy? And connected with this, from the same user says, how do we avoid epistemological extractivism used for the maintenance of this status quo?
Yes, well, the first thing I would say is that, at least as I approach decolonization, is not, I mean, let me say this, it's curious now that there is now at the present, right, a discourse on decolonization on certain parts of the academy, while the core remains liberal, and even those parts, at most, they typically engage in decoloniality light. But even as I said before, even decoloniality light in the university can appear as a kind of, you know, can make a big wave, or can make can felt very threatening. So from there, the space that somehow decoloniality is linked to these intellectuals in the academy. But I think that they have never been the source of that. If anything, they have brokered some of the ideas that have been produced, particularly outside of the academy, and then they have introduced them in particular ways. But if you look at decolonization as being grounded in different collectives and movements, most of which probably outside the university, and if they have come through the university but not stay at the university only, then you see, you relativize the value of these voices in the academy. I mean, and why would this voice in the academy, I mean, they are embracing decoloniality, and if they are doing it in the form of decoloniality light, then, you know, completely consistent that they remain quiet, right? That they is consistent in a lot of behaviors that are typical with liberal intellectuals. But if you look decoloniality as related with the movements, you see that then those movements, like the movements that I was cited before, right, giving different examples of the forms of solidarity between indigenous and Black movements, you see, you can find then people who are in the academy who work with these movements and who are coming out and who are participating in these movements and who are having their voices, right? I would say pay attention to that ground of decoloniality and anything to intellectuals who say that they are linked to those movements, and not simply to whoever you consider to be the starts of the decoloniality in your field, because that will not get you so far necessarily. And the other question was about the extractivism. And yes, actually, I think I've made the point that in decoloniality light, one of the main issues is this issue about extractivism. That is, you're drawing ideas that have been cultivated through sweat and blood outside the academy, and now you codified it in particular ways. And now they run with your name attached to them, right? And you become the author of certain ideas. So there is a way of extracting these ideas and sort of making professional careers out of different forms of extractivism and neo-extractivism. Again, what I think is crucial is this question of breaking these separation walls between the university and outside the university. And it's crucial to conceive of decolonization as a struggle where all of us need to become co-combatants. And so therefore, in that context, you are rather engaging in the circulation of ideas and duties and practices in a context with others, and not in extractivism, right? So you engage in collaboration, where you participate with others, many of whom are not in the academy. And then that's a way in which you begin to break the mold and the possibility of becoming extractivist, intentionally or unintentionally.
Thank you. We have now a question from a collective that is posed in the Humboldt University. They are live streaming right now, and they want to ask you, and I quote, Professor Maldonado-Torres has mentioned how certain words, such as settler colonialism, are dismissed even when they are mentioned in South Africa's ICJ case. If possible, could you expand a little on this aspect, on how Western discourse labels legal jargon as political now and is able to abandon its own institutions, the ICJ and the international law, when they challenge global north? And on a smaller scale, we, the collective, have experienced repeated efforts of canceling and censorship over the use of the words genocide, even in the wake of the ICJ case. For instance, they were not able to publicly announce this streaming or your lecture because the university administration found the word contentious. And that was their explanation for this.
Yes, this is, I mean, this is the liberal repressive academy at its best or worst, right? Applying these terms of censorship, even with ideas and concepts that have been circulated and have getting legitimacy in other contexts, right? But suddenly they become kind of unlawful or outlawed if they begin to be mobilized to refer to other movements. So there is a lot of policing to make sure, first, to reduce the possibility of terms that are used for criticizing, and second, to delimit them in areas that are acceptable to the academy or to the Western order, that keep the legitimacy of the barbarism civilization schema at work. But this has also happened even with the discourse on human rights. Even with the discourse on human rights, you find many people going and say, well, I'm calling for a ceasefire and not opposed to the genocide in Gaza on the basis of human rights, not on the basis, not even settler colonialism, not even, right, not implying that there are other structures at work, even just focusing on the question of human rights. But even that is set apart. So the West has created, at first, delimited the field of possible accepted concepts, has delimited the field, narrowed them, then create rules to how you use those concepts and when you use them, right? And then it's certainly, even the ones that it creates that seems more universal are very narrowed in scope. So you can do very little. Even with the UN, right? There is even the Commission of Human Rights. They have come out and also call attention to the violence that is happening, to the genocide and so on, and that is easily kind of dismissed by the liberal state, even though human rights is part of the liberal idiom, right? So in moments like that, these institutions give themselves the power and the privilege to even suspend the discourses that they have generated and authorized, as inoffensive as they are typically. But if it challenges certain presumptions, then they are targeted down. This is, again, liberalism. And this is when you say, why do you need fascism when you have this kind of liberalism, right? Why? When liberalism is doing the work of fascism anyway, and then it's expecting that it's going to produce another kind of society less inclined to the right? No, it's being complicit. It's preparing the terrain for fascism and right-wing discourse. So liberals have to really determine what they want to do. How do they want to direct their institutions? because so far they have been largely complicit with fascism, I think.
Here's another one following the question on liberalism, and it's a comment on the question. Says, I'm quite puzzled that liberalism as a legitimation of imperial politics is able not only to ignore criticism, but to incorporate it and render it harmless, as has happened to feminism, to multiculturalism, and so on. And I gradually becoming quite pessimistic, it says, that criticism and resistance will have any effect at all against imperialism and capitalism on the West. Could you perhaps give us a concrete example of where resistance and criticism have been successful and how it could become successful?
Yes, I can, but nothing that I can say is successful means that it somehow is out of contradictions or is somehow conquered a space where you can engage in pristine forms of decolonial collaboration or anything like that. All of the successful spaces remain spaces in tension and spaces in contention and competition, right? All of them remain zones of struggle because the struggle, in a way, it's very difficult for it to end. So you need a larger transformation of things for the struggle, for these specific struggles to end, because they are connected to the whole. So it's in that sense that I will classify any kind of success, right? All of them are relative to a moment, to a particular predicament, and usually they are successful in overcoming a number of issues, but then they face another sort of issues, or even the institutions generate other forms of opposition to contain them where they, to contain them to the space that they earn, that they obtain. And therefore and sometimes then to use them against their own goals and principles. So there's no space that I can say is being successful that is not also not completely successful, and it's a place in contention, and maybe a space that can become even counterproductive at some moment or another, right? But for example, I can give you moments. I've done most of my career, of academic career, I have done it in units that emerged out of student mobilization, out of student strikes, right? And students occupying buildings and taking over universities. The first one was at the University of California at Berkeley, where students who organized themselves as the Third World Liberation Front confronted the university, and that led to the emergence of the first ethnic studies departments. But what they were demanding was a third world college, and at San Francisco State University and at the University of California, Berkeley. And Berkeley, they only created a department, not a college, of ethnic studies, not of third world liberation. Right? So already there, in that first step, as important as it was, there was a compromise, right? There was already part of the university was containing what it would do. But even that was important, and that opened up a space for certain kind of scholars to be generated and so on. Originally, the spirit of that space of was ethnic studies was precisely to produce and engage in relevant education. And relevant education was conceived as a form of thinking and teaching that did not see separations between the university and the outside of the university. Right? It was meant to be much more, community-oriented and connected to the struggles of Black, indigenous, racialized peoples that lived close to those universities, right? So that was the spirit. But of course, when the university begins to confine the project, first you are ethnic studies, and you are not, right, third world liberation. Second, you are supposed to earn a degree, and this is how you do it. And these things that has to do with community, you should be letting these things go, right? Now, the department for a long time fought for that. And then a few years ago, a number of years ago, then what they call community work became fashionable. And then you find universities now engaging in the public humanities and all of that. They were kind of barely gesturing towards something that was crucial in ethnic study from the beginning, but the liberal institution was shutting it down, right? As long as it was being led by mainly people of color, intellectuals of color in connection with the communities, right? So these are the ways in which the contradictions and the struggles continue. So you do advance, right? Without that space, many of us it would have been much more difficult for many. So, I mean, so many hundreds of students going through the different so-called ethnic studies programs, as compromised and limited and self-contradictory as they are, as it is true that some intellectuals have come into the space and they have, perhaps because they have not been trained in ethnic studies as such, they are trained to traditional fields, and they intentionally or unintentionally reintroduce the disciplines into these other spaces and reintroduce colonial methods into these spaces that are meant to be about decolonization. It is true that all those things are happening, and nonetheless, I would consider it was an important act and a success, relative success, to have been able to open that. And that being able then for many of us to do other things, right, to take that insurgency at another level and to increase the crack, right, to cite Catherine Walsh again. So those are the advances that you do. And it's all possible. I mean, as a director of an institute, I was able to engage in various forms of collaboration with decolonial movements outside of the university and do that in a real collaborative way that was producing, was contributing to the disciplines in the university by allowing everyone and anyone to be exposed to a form of thinking and producing knowledge and organizing that was not contained by the university. So, but then again, right, you see, that only lasts so long and we need more and more people entering into these spaces and stretching further the gains of these movements, because this is an intergenerational struggle. And that's the idea, right? It will be there for a long time.
Thank you very much. I think we are slowly coming to an end. I would like just to pose the last question, taking advantage that you already mentioned the students' movements and their importance. Now, given the generational shift we've seen in the protests against the genocide in Gaza, that are led mostly by critical youth, not only in Europe, but worldwide, what message do you, as a key thinker in decolonial thought, would have for this young generation that are facing, no doubt, unprecedented hostility and belligerence from conservative right-wing factions?
Yes, that's an important question. I'm thinking about, for example, I don't know, many in the audience, I don't know if you were around in the 1980s. In the 1980s, in the US particularly, there was a lot of student activism around the South African apartheid, right? And that generated a strong divestment movement from South Africa. And there are current, like, so-called, left-wing scholars, intellectuals through the academy who, as students, they were deeply involved in the South Africa struggle against apartheid, right? Now, then it came 1994, Mandela rose to power, and it's like many of these supporters and movements, they checked out, right? Because apartheid is formally over. That was 1994. So suddenly that campuses that disappear, that question disappeared from campus, to the extent that maybe now you ask many of the undergraduate students about the South African movement and so on, they may not have any idea. But what happened in South Africa? Did apartheid finish in South Africa? Right? And so it did not take long, 2015 and 2016, it saw large mobilization of Black students, Black South African students, calling for the decolonization of education, for a free university. They want a free decolonized education. And for the question of land redistribution, right? And so were the many supporters of South Africa, right, that were in the 80s, many of them, again, had checked out from this in 1994. So I would say to the young generation, just as now the young generation, part of it is being kind of oriented, sensibilized, politicized around the question of Palestine, that is crucial. Don't be deceived to thinking that, question whether you think it's two-state or one state or the end of the or calling for a ceasefire, that somehow all of those things finish the struggle, right? Like that's the end of the struggle. That is not, and that's why what Decolonize this place puts to the on the table, which is if you're really committed with that struggle, the issue is not really you to think or to know that yes, settler colonialism exists, fine, and that Israel is an example among others of that, and therefore we are opposed to these settler colonial projects, fine. But if you're not able to develop a way of thinking that allows you to see how wherever you are, in Berlin, in New York, in Puerto Rico, in Brazil, wherever you are, there are long legacies of coloniality. If you're not able to see that and to connect with people there, really, you may still be having a superficial account of decoloniality. And whenever something happens in Palestine that you think that got fixed, then you are checked out and then you move on, right? Like it happened to many in the South African struggle. So we need to take this opportunity to rethink this and to have a different approach to decolonization. And I think that will be part of the challenge for the current generation, how to really reach that level of depth when it comes to decolonial thinking and activity, and how to keep it there. And this includes also, looking at Palestine, at the reality that even capitalism is running rampant, even in places like the West Bank. Even when you see that the model of there is a place called Rawabi in the West Bank, which is like a huge mall with residential offices. It's like the model of life that is given even to some Palestinian, even in occupied territories, is that they should be dreaming for this kind of life in the first world, consumerist life in the first world. So when you think, well, what happens if there is Palestinian state in the, would it be capitalist, right? I mean, what do we want to do, and how do we do it? It goes beyond. Yes, we want the end to the war, we want the end to occupation, but decoloniality also goes further than that, and it begins at home. It begins where you are.
I think with that great statement, I think we will close now. We want to express our deepest thanks to Dr. Nelson Maldonado-Torres for sharing his perspective and knowledge with us, and for illuminating the path to a deeper understanding and combative decoloniality. We also want to thank all the participants for their presence, their questions, their commitment to the topic. Your participation enriches our dialogue, strengthens our community of critical thinking. Thank you all. We remind all of you that you can stay informed about our lecture series and other events through our website, decolonial.net, or our social media, also from the Student Coalition Berlin. And thank you again for joining us in this space for learning, for dialogue. We hope to have your presence in future events. Thank you all. Have an excellent rest of the day, and until the next time. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye-bye.